That is what it is.
Hey guys, this is Eric Weingartner with Weingartner Racing. This video is, that's right, more intake manifolds that were tested on the Dyno Mule. Several of you have been dying for this one. These are the racier versions of the intake manifolds. For those that are unfamiliar with this test, let me describe it. I had a small block 400s Chevy built just to do dyno testing, and I tested 12 different manifolds. I broke the videos down into sets of 3 that are alike, and that's what's going to be shared. So that's essentially what's happening today with these 3 manifolds. The combination, in case you wonder what the engine is, it's 406 small block Chevy, 11.2 compression ratio, 11.3, AFR 195 enforcer heads. They are stock except for I changed the springs to run a solid roller spring. Speaking of the cam is from Urson. They donated that. And it's a 260, 270. And it has 680 lift and a 108 lobe separation. I should also point out before I share any of this stuff with you, I know how hard it is to see some of these pictures and whatnot on YouTube. So I've actually got all the data, not just 3 manifolds, every piece of data from the dyno test. And I've collated it into a book. And if you would like to purchase that book, you can email me at weingartnerracing.com, and I will, once I get them printed, I will bill you for those, and you can get those. I'm going to charge $10 more than what it cost me to print them. Currently, it looks like it's going to be about 25 bucks is what that'll be, plus shipping, so maybe $5 for shipping, so about 30 bucks. You have about 65 pages worth of data, quite a bit. But anyway, you get to see way more stuff, much easier to see than trying to zoom in on your smartphone, watching this on YouTube or on your big screen TV. Anyway, that's what it is. I want to tell you that before I get further into it. This combination is actually pretty good. So these 3 manifolds were compared because they're all about the same height. So in a previous test, I had compared ones that were shorter. These ones are actually the taller, more racier style manifolds. So we're going to talk about their dimensions, and I'll actually get to show you not only peak horsepower, the average horsepower, and you'll get to see the comparison on a chart or a graph, so you can see how much better one was than the other. So anyway, let's get to it. This one is an Edelbrock 2892. Somewhere it's got the part number right there. This is what they call the Super Victor 2. It's more of a newer design. However, the trick flow is by far the newest of these 3 that we have here. It's a 2892, and I should also point out too that on the dyno, they're all tested with the same carburetor. It's 1000 CFM Race Demon carburetor that was redone by Mark Whitener, and I used an AFR 4-hole taper spacer, 1 inch tall, on all 3, and it was used on every single manifold. The reason why is because if you're not running a spacer, you really should, and I've never seen a spacer lose power. The worst case, it makes the exact same. So most people run spacers more than don't, so that's the reason why it was tested that way. You get the idea. Anyway, this one's it looks huge. So if you look at the height from the rest, it looks like it's taller, but that's not necessarily the case. This one has a drop-down valley tray compared to the others, far more than the other ones do. So because of that, it looks taller, but actual plenum depth is a little shorter. So if we measure the depth down the bottom, it's 4.25 inches deep, compared to this is the Trick Flow R, which is 4.5, and our Holley 300-110 is 4.5. No port work was done whatsoever to any one of these manifolds. However, the thing you're going to see in the dyno results has to do something with the port matching. So even though I'm using the AFR 195 enforcer heads, they are not port matched. They're completely stock. So their ports are actually a little bit smaller than a 1206, but slightly bigger than a 1205 gasket size. However, looking at the Edelbrock, this is exactly how it comes. It is CNC gasket matched to a 1206 with a pretty good corner radius. So that's this one. So in other words, these exits are bigger than what's on the head. This is my next manifold. Oh, by the way, this runner, is 5.92 inches long. It ends up being one of the longest runners of all the manifolds tested. And definitely of these 3, it's far longer. Its opening, so as I measured it for the cross-sectional opening, is 4.33, and its exit's 2.75. Next manifold. This one's a bit different. These 2 look very, very similar, but they're slightly different. This is a Trick Flow R. It literally just came out probably a few months ago. And this one's a bit different. It is 4.5 inches deep, but if you notice, and you can probably take a good peek there, Look how much bigger that opening is on the outside runner compared to the inside runner. They have two different cross-sectional areas. The outside one measures 5.43 inches, while the inside one measures 3.73. No, taken out. So 3.73 cross-sectional area there. 5.29, I told you wrong. 5.29 cross-sectional area here. The runner length average, I should have pointed that out. I'm averaging these four, and it's 5.29. When I average those four, it's 5.92. So, but you might say, well, that's a horrible idea, having the bigger opening compared to the inside one. They're definitely different. It's horrible. I will say this, and you'll see this on the dyno, the graph, the line graph. Having two different opening areas, it creates two different tuning waves. So there's a part where they're not exactly the same. So in theory, what could happen with having them different like this, you could have where this one's about to sign off, it's not making as much, and this one's much better than the higher RPM. So in theory, it could increase your power range, not necessarily peak power, but it can make it extend longer. This did something really weird with the graph, which you're going to see. So that one's really different from the others, because all the others, their cross-sectional areas are about the same between the inner and outer, even with this one. This one's the only one of the ones 12 I tested that was different. Next note. These are the exits. It's exits as cast. It's not ported in any way. But its exits are almost a 1206, so it's almost the same size as the Edelbrock. However, I'm going to talk more about the port match in just a minute, because I think that had a part to play in the power that came from them. So there's that. This last one's a Holley. Somewhere around here I've got this. I guess not. But anyway, this is a Holley. There it is. Holley 300-110. Do not confuse it with the 300-25. I didn't get a chance to test that one. This is like they call it the Keith Thornton. Sometimes it's called that. Runner length is 5.26, which is actually shorter than the other two. And its plenum depth is the same depth as the Trickflow R. Its opening area is 4.28, which is smaller than the Edelbrock and smaller or bigger than the inside runner on the Trickflow, but not near as big as the outside runner. This one, its port openings look like this, which is actually, it's smaller than a 1206, but it has a bit of a problem, which I'm going to talk about. And I think this one, you'll see why it didn't do very well. If you were to rank these, in case you're wondering on the power-wise, and I'll show you the graphs in just a minute, this was the best, second, third of the 3 tested here. However, of all the 12 tested, this was second to last as far as power and torque, and especially on the torque. Just to give you an idea, this one made like 509 foot-pounds of torque. I think this was 524, and you'll get to see the charts in just a minute. And this was right around 526, something like that. You'll see that in charts, trust me, in a minute. This was just way, way off. Now, what was interesting about these is how it landed, how each one of the ports on the manifold landed with the head. So let me explain. This is a 1206, so obviously it's bigger than the head that's slightly bigger than a 1205, but definitely not bigger than a 1206. But this is. So when I was putting on the manifolds on the dyno and I'm trying to get them to line up the best, this is where it gets interesting. The floor, which is this part right here, actually lined up really close to the floor of the head. However, the intake manifold opening itself, when I'm looking down through the, so I'm looking down this side and I look at the head, I can actually see the top of the head port. So in other words, the head port is like right here. So the intake's actually overhanging it, but it's overhanging on the roof, okay? So this is kind of plays somewhat importance because the opposite effect happens on this one. So if you've ever wondered, I wonder if it's worse that it overhangs on the roof or on the floor, well, it might be worse to be on the floor. This one, the Trickflow, was a little different, and it's not quite as tall as this, so I think it's about close to 1206, not quite. What I noticed the biggest thing about this, though, is it was wider, so it even looks wider than this. This one, on the ports on the head, this intake manifold actually, if you look down in it, you would see the head, the head was inside this opening, width-wise. The outside's not so much, I mean, it was a little, but definitely more noticeable on the inside. Now, the Holley, though, this is where it was a bit bizarre, really bizarre. Its top was about where the opening of the head is, but the bottom wasn't. It was actually sitting lower than the heads at the bottom. So 3 different manifolds, 3 set entirely different ways. Roof overhang on this one, and of course a little bit on, don't get me wrong, it's still a little bit on these ones as well, but definitely not as more noticeable as this. This one, the roof and stuff was off, but not near as much as that. This was like, in other words, it felt like it was more centered up and down, but the width on these was so much wider. Then you have this one where the bottom is there. So if you're asking me, because this one performed absolutely the worst, I mean, there's no doubt, you'll see in the graphs in just a minute, than the other two, I think this might have revealed something. It's worse to have the port overhang on the bottom than it is the top, which would, it seemed counterintuitive, because you would figure this would be the worst one because there's more airspeed at the top of the intake port than the bottom, but it didn't look that way. And it didn't look like the sides made that all that much of a difference. So anyway, we'll get to the dyno numbers and you could see what I'm talking about. But I wanted to point that out because besides the design itself, I think the port openings had something to do with it as well. I think that's influencing the power difference a little bit. So anyway, let's look at the numbers. Okay, here's your dyno numbers. Now this is the Holley 300-110, and when you're looking at this, I want you to know this, that the air-fuel ratios, they're right and they're wrong, and let me explain. This Holley 300-110, we'd also tested with a 2-barrel before doing the 4-barrel, because we'd already, when we did the Brodix, that was the last intake before this one, we had tested with a 2-barrel, so it made no sense to redo all the fuel stuff, so we just put the, when we put the Holley on, we put the 2-barrel to test first, and then we switched over to the 4-barrel. So this is the numbers from the 4-barrel. But what happens is we cap off one of the lines on the dyno on the manifold for fuel, because obviously a 2-barrel only has the front bowl. So we cap off that line there and disconnect it. So when we go back to a 4-barrel, we hook back up that line. You're like, what's this got to do with it? Bear with me. Until the rear needle and seat opens, it's not going to flow any fuel through that line that we just connected. So in other words, that fuel line is actually completely empty. Now the fuel bowl is, it's full because we didn't dump it or drain it before we took it off. So the minute we start making a run and that rear needle and seat opens, it has to fill the entire fuel line, which is about 4 feet, then the fuel bowl. And so these numbers that you see on here for air fuel ratio are calculated. So in other words, it's measuring the airflow and it's measuring how much fuel flow, and then it calculates, sorry, there's fuel flow, and calculates your air fuel ratio. Point being is this number's off because it's trying to fill that line. The actual O2 sensor said about what you would expect, 12.8, 13.0. So that's why this looks wrong. It's not really wrong. That's why it cleans up at the end. Anyway, to this, most of the other manifolds, their peak power occurred at 62. This one and a couple others didn't. This one actually occurs at 62, but some of the others don't, which you'll see in a second. This one's 541, it made for horsepower, and the torque was pretty miserable at 509. I shouldn't say miserable, but from the 12 manifolds tested, this one was right there with the torque link as being the worst. So there may be something having the port match sitting lower or the design itself. Anyway, there's that. Here's an interesting note, pay attention to this. This is how much airflow it actually pulled in, 668 CFM. So there's the Holley. By the way, all this information I'm getting is from the dyno book I mentioned at the beginning of the video. These cost 38 bucks shipped. All right, now for the trick flow. If I can get it to turn a page. There we go. Here's a trick flow. And you can see the air fuel ratios. These are calculated. Look how close it is now. So 13.0, 12.9, 12.8, 13.0, pretty close. Anyway, its peak power is 551. It's at 6,400 RPM, so 200 later than the Holley. Its torque's almost 10 foot-pounds more at 520-ish, right there at 5,000. Notice also that it pulls in 669 CFM. So one more CFM, not really difference. Anyway, let's go on to the last one, which is the Edelbrock, and I can show you a graph to show the difference. Here's the Edelbrock Super Victor 2. If you notice, its air fuel ratios are a little bit different, not that far though, and you see how close they kind of say? It's pretty close. Also notice it only pulled in 669 CFM, same as Trick Flow R. Now, horsepower 555 and torque 521.3. So a little bit different, but as cool as that is, the graph really gives away the picture. So here we go. Let me see if I can flip the page here. Yeah, this is your graph. So let me flip my book here. By the way, I should point out, by accident, he printed the uncorrected numbers. So the graph overlay is correct, but these are just uncorrected. That's why it says 508. That's actually what it was measured. All the other numbers are showed as corrected. That's just an error in the printing of the graph. The lines, everything else is correct on it. So anyway, let's look at it. You got the red line, which is the Holley, which as you could tell, and this is, by the way, the reason why, like, wow, it's up there at the lower RPM. That's just the way the dyno loads it. This is its true numbers, and as you can tell, it's a turd. It's a turd. Trick Flow R, that's that black one, which you can barely see because it's tracing really closely with the Edelbrock 2892 until right here. And you can see how much better the Edelbrock is until about here. And this is more related to the air, the engine not pulling enough air because the heads are smallish. So I think if we had a bigger set of heads on, which will be retested, so all this will be done when we get some, redo the heads to make them better and some different heads that actually move more air. All this stuff will be redone. So you can actually see, does it make a difference because of the heads being flowing not very much, or is it a bigger difference when the heads flow more? But anyway, if you look, the Edelbrock itself is better here in this range, and it's better from here on. Now also, I told you about the Trick Flow R having that 2 different sized entries. So like the opening on the back ports on the Trick Flow R are much bigger than the inside ones. And you might say, why did they do that? Well, what it does is it creates 2 tuning waves or windows. So there's a spot where the larger outside runners are going to be far more efficient than the inside. So the inside might work better at a lower RPM while the outside ones look better at a higher RPM. What would this do? In theory, what it does, it'll extend the power band, but it won't make it have as much peak as it would if they were all the same. So hopefully that makes some sense to you. This kind of shows up in here, because if you look, this is the Trick Flow R Black. From this range right here, you can kind of see how it does this weird dip and starts gaining. It's because it's coming out of the tuning window of the short one, and we start coming into the tuning window of the larger one, and that's why it's getting closer to matching the Edelbrock up here. But through this range, it doesn't have as much punch because they're not all the same. But then once that larger one in the back starts coming into its tuning window, boom, now it starts gaining a little bit. And that's why you see that. In theory, it actually should cause it to make this and carry it further. So that's the idea. But the Edelbrock, being that they're all about the same, it's just a better design anyway. It carries 4 and makes more in this range. So on the track, if you were doing this in the car, there's no way that the Trick Flow R is outrunning that 2892. I mean, you could tell. And both of them are going to be a noticeable difference over that Holley 300 110. Now, don't take this as a blanket statement either, too, because remember, this is just one engine. And I do plan to, redo the test to see if this is like universal, because that'd be a nice test to know. Is like this head's only flowed like 270, something like that. What happens when we have a head that flows 330? Is the same thing going to happen, or is the differences that become, larger? So, anyway, that's something to think about. So.
Last thing I want to leave you with is this. If you watch any of my other videos about the manifolds, you'll know this as well. This is not the end of the manifold testing. It's just the beginning. So this manifold right here is that I got. I was purchased because a customer wanted me to port this. So I ordered it for him and whatnot. So what's going to happen is when we go back on the dyno, this one's going to be completely fully ported, and we'll get to test that again. I don't know that it's going to make a huge difference on this engine, just because the manifold itself is probably flowing enough to match the need of the engine and the head that it has on now. Once we step up to a different head, it probably will make much more of a difference. This one I purchased myself just because I wanted to see what it would do. This one, what I'm going to do is, I've done this already. This is a little cardboard template, and I'm going to cut out a piece of aluminum that's this thick. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add on extensions. So I'm going to try to put this down and grab them with my other hand.
Essentially what I'm gonna do is weld it on such as so. So I'm gonna add the extensions on like that. Hopefully you get the idea. This is about 1 inch, and I'm gonna add it and we'll see what that does. So extending the runner is what goes on there. This manifold is for a customer for me to port. However, I doubt this goes back on the dyno. So yeah, I'll fully port it, but you probably won't ever see this one again getting tested. So sorry about that one. But anyway, I thought I'd do the surface finish, just testing surface finishes on the strict flow, but I'm not. I'm gonna do that on a different one. So, but this one I'm gonna try some runner extensions. Fully ported, just see what we do. I doubt it makes much gains on this engine, but it may. This, I don't know, we'll see. Anyway, guys, thanks for watching. Remember, I'm no Superman. You guys take care.